Hello, everyone. I have recently finished playing South of Midnight, and while I sit in that sort of post-game emptiness that we get sometimes after we've spent hours and hours with a game, I can already tell this is one that's going to stick with me for a while, and it's one that I think that people should give a chance. It's not a perfect game, I will talk a bit about that, but there's something about the world that it builds, the emotional stories, and the feeling that it leaves behind that feels familiar to me and makes me want to invite people in.
A talking fish? Nope. Ain't no way.
So this isn't a review, this isn't even really an analysis, it's just a reflection. My own personal thoughts and connection with the game's lore, as well as a little nudge if you've been thinking about playing but you weren't so sure. I won't share any major spoilers, but I will touch on a few details, so feel free to leave and come back if you want to go into the game completely blind. Now, if you've watched my content before, you know I'm not typically one for games with a whole lot of combat. Well, except for Hellblade: Senua's Sacrifice, that game is awesome. But South of Midnight pulled me in the second that I saw the trailer. And that's because honestly, it looked a lot like home. Just like our protagonist Hazel, I am a Black female raised in the Deep South, and this game was a real reflection of that Southern vibe. And not just in the aesthetics or the spot-on dialects, but the way that we approach hardship. Ghost stories and superstitions passed down through the generations are all a part of the atmosphere that I grew up in, and it made me think about how the past and the present are never really separate. They're layered, woven together. In the game, you fight haints, which are restless souls which are tied to trauma and pain, and I grew up hearing stories about haints. I remember being warned to burn the hair that was left behind in my comb after I fixed my hair so that nobody could take it and do some sort of voodoo spell on me. I didn't always understand the superstitions or the stories, but they lived in a very real way in the background of my life, in the same way that it lives in the details of the game. And the details in South of Midnight are really real. These rundown buildings and homes are just like the ones you find in the small country towns all throughout the Deep South. And you cannot convince me that this mascot was not based on the quintessential Southern grocery chain, the good old Piggly Wiggly. I grew up seeing bottle trees in people's yards, and I knew about the African folktale of Brer Rabbit that Hazel sort of mentions almost offhandedly. Even the small details like the sound of the bugs or those damned fire ants or the references to catfish and grits. You should totally try fish and grits if you ever find yourself at the Southern Fish Fry. So while much of this world is rooted in fantasy and folklore, much of it is really true to life. One of the elements I think is so cool that they included were the above ground tombs that are found in states like Louisiana to keep the bodies from washing out of them, during heavy rains or a flood. I actually visited one on a tour when I went to New Orleans, and they told us how multiple bodies are buried in each one. So after a body that's decomposed pretty quickly in the Louisiana heat, they place it in a bag and move the body to the bottom of the tomb to make room for a new body to be placed in the upper half. Oh, and these slave cabins? I've stood in so many of those back in South Carolina. I went to one of those reenactment museums where all the workers are essentially cosplaying various roles from back in pre-Civil War times. It's actually kind of funny because apparently not many Black people visit there. So the one Black military officer, the Black slave women, and the butler of the big house, they weren't supposed to break character, but they did anyway for me because they wanted to have some real talk about the real history of the plantation and not just this wholesome illusion that the museum was selling. The history isn't always pretty, but it's ours. Another reason I was really drawn in is I really love stop motion. I grew up watching Gumby in those Christmas claymation specials we had on VHS tapes. I watched them over and over and over year after year. So seeing a game lean so hard into that aesthetic felt comforting. And more games are tapping into this style. Harold Halibut came out last year, and then there's Truberbrook and even Papertura, a game that's made entirely out of paper. How cool is that? There's something so imperfect about stop motion that I just find endearing. And in South of Midnight, I feel it really works. It has just enough for those of us who like that kind of style, but it's not overwhelming for those who don't. And it makes the characters feel handmade, like it's art come to life. But what really stuck with me, what made me feel something, was the theme of weaving. Hazel finds out that she's a weaver, and weavers in this world can see the knots in the grand tapestry of time. Pain that hasn't been released, trauma passed down from generation to generation. And a weaver's job is to unravel it using these giant sewing needles and spindles and, other weaving type of tools to help the souls finally let go. Sometimes we don't even know how much pain we're holding on to until it's all released from us. But I do have a few critiques about the game. While the concept of unraveling these haints and releasing the pain is a symbolic one, the fights do get a bit repetitive. You get new versions of the haints, but they sort of feel like the same fight over and over. Also, some of the levels drag on much too long. And sometimes Hazel doesn't always react to your input, leading you to take damage at times when you shouldn't have. Minor issue, never did me in, but need to point that out. Also, I think some sequences could have easily been shortened, maybe some chapters condensed into one. I think the message of the game can get a bit overshadowed by the gameplay. There was definitely a point where I felt like the game had reached its natural end and it just kept going. But then there's those moments where you start getting pieces of the lore and the story starts to come together. And then the boss fights and these awesome character designs of these bosses, which they did an awesome job with these characters. Those moments really help kind of reinvigorate you throughout the game. So, at points it's a slog, but I feel it's worth it in the end. One of the other things that they included that I thought was of good attention to detail was the addition of quilts. In the book Hidden in Plain View, A Secret of Quilts in the Underground Railroad, it tells the story of how quilts help slaves escape via the Underground Railroad. It talks about plantation seamstresses that would stitch patterns into quilts as a secret code, and then when the quilts were hung up, this gave the slaves the opportunity to memorize the pattern and the associated meanings and use their memory of what all of those patterns mean to help them on their journey. So when they would see other quilts hanging out on the line or draped over window sills of safe houses, they knew they were going in the right direction or some sort of important information was communicated. Now, this has largely been disputed and is probably more folklore than fact, but it was such a meaningful addition to the powers of the weaver because quilts are a form of storytelling too. They carry memories. Most of the early quilts were made from bits of old clothing kids had grown out of or old linen that can no longer be used, all stitched together. So it weaves in the past as a way of making something new for the future. And in this game, it's that same spirit that's there in this whole grand tapestry of life. The patterns that show up again and again, the pain that Hazel must unravel and reweave, all of our hurts and histories all stitched together, but finally being released. So those are just some of my thoughts. Clearly not so game related, but hey, sometimes it just be like that. It's not perfect, but it's personal. And I do think that it deserves to be experienced. And if you made it this far, thank you so much. You have my undying gratitude. Before you leave the channel, there are a couple other videos that I've made about games connected to real world folklore that I think you should check out. And with that, I am Journey, and I will see you in the next one.